At 64, Garth Brooks should be enjoying the view from the top of a mountain he spent 40 years climbing. Instead, he's standing in the middle of a storm that has nothing to do with music. A man who built his entire public identity around trust, sincerity, and being the guy next door is now fighting a legal battle that has stretched on for close to 2 years, with no end visible on the horizon. This is the story of how the most successful solo artist in American music history got here, and why his story at 64 feels less like a victory lap and more like a test of everything he claims to stand for. Start with the numbers, because the numbers are almost impossible to overstate. Garth Brooks has sold well over 150 million albums worldwide, placing him among the best-selling solo artists in the history of recorded music, in the same conversation as Elvis Presley and the Beatles. He didn't just sell records. He rewired what a country concert was supposed to look and feel like. Before Garth, country shows were, for most part, modest affairs, a band, a stage, a set list. Garth brought wireless headset microphones so he could run the length of an arena floor. He brought pyrotechnics. He brought a rock and roll sense of scale to a genre that had spent decades being told to stay small and stay humble. Critics accused him of turning country into spectacle. Fans didn't care. They packed stadiums by the tens of thousands, and country music was never quite the same after him. But none of that happened by accident, and none of it happened quickly. Troy Garth Brooks was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and raised primarily in the small town of Yukon, just outside Oklahoma City. His father, Troy Raymond Brooks Jr., worked as a draftsman for an oil company and had once served in the military. His mother, Colleen Carroll, had actually recorded music and performed on a local television show in the 1950s before setting aside her own career to raise 6 children. Music wasn't a foreign concept in that house. It was ordinary. Garth grew up with a guitar around, singing in a household where creative ambition already had precedent. Even if nobody in that house knew, it would eventually produce one of the biggest recording artists on the planet. He went to Oklahoma State University on a track and field scholarship, throwing javelin, and it was there that he started performing more seriously in local clubs. He wasn't a prodigy who was discovered overnight. He was a young man who kept showing up to open mic nights and bar gigs around Stillwater, slowly figuring out who he wanted to be as a performer. When he first tried to break into Nashville in 1985, it didn't work. He famously turned around and drove back to Oklahoma the same day, discouraged by what he found. It took him 2 more years and a great deal more preparation before he moved to Nashville for good in 1987 and started building the relationships and material that would eventually become his self-titled debut album in 1989. That first album did well, but it wasn't the explosion that made him a household name. That came with his second album, No Fences, in 1990, and its lead single Friends in Low Places, which became one of the defining country anthems of the decade. From there, the momentum became almost impossible to stop. Rope in the Wind in 1991 debuted at number 1 on the all-genre Billboard 200 chart, an almost unheard-of feat for a country album at the time. Garth wasn't just topping the country charts. He was competing directly with pop and rock records for the biggest sales weeks in the country, and he was winning. What made him different wasn't only the music. It was the show. He turned his concerts into full theatrical productions, complete with elaborate staging, and he brought an athletic, almost chaotic physicality to performing that country audiences hadn't really seen before. He would run across the stage, climb rigging, throw himself into the crowd's energy the way rock frontmen did. Traditionalists in Nashville worried he was making the genre too big, too loud, too commercial. What actually happened is that he opened the door for country music to become genuinely mainstream, competing for the same audiences as rock and pop acts, filling football stadiums instead of fairgrounds. Nearly every country artist who has headlined a stadium tour since owes some part of that opportunity to the audience Garth proved existed. Alongside the professional rise came a marriage that started well before any of the fame arrived. Garth married Sandy Mal in 1986 before he'd ever set foot in a Nashville recording studio as a signed artist. She was there for the years of clubs and open mics, and she was there in the earliest stretch of stardom when his life started accelerating faster than almost anyone could manage. The couple had 3 daughters together, Taylor, August, and Allie, born in the early to mid-1990s, right at the peak of Garth's commercial explosion. That timing mattered enormously. The years when his career was expanding at the fastest rate were also the years his daughters were the youngest, and the tension between those two realities eventually became too much for the marriage to bear. Garth and Sandy divorced in 2001, and Garth has spoken publicly, more than once, about how much the demands of superstardom contributed to that outcome. That divorce triggered one of the most talked about decisions of his career. In 2001, at the absolute height of his commercial power, Garth Brooks stepped back from touring and largely receded from the public eye, citing his desire to be present for his daughters during their remaining childhood years. He didn't disappear completely. There were still releases and select appearances, but he deliberately turned down the volume on a career that, by any conventional logic, should have kept accelerating. He has said in interviews that he didn't want his daughters to grow up only seeing him on a stage or a television screen. It was an unusual choice for an artist at his level, and it remains one of the more genuinely selfless pivots in modern music history, even if it cost him years of commercial momentum that a competitor might never have been willing to give up. Before that retreat, though, there was a strange detour that still puzzles people who lived through it: Chris Gaines. In 1999, Garth developed an entire alter ego persona, a fictional pop-rock musician named Chris Gaines, complete with a different look, a soundtrack album, and plans for an accompanying film that never materialized. The project was framed as a creative experiment, a way to explore music outside the boundaries of the Garth Brooks brand. It confused far more people than it converted. Critics and fans alike struggled to understand what exactly they were watching, and the film component was eventually shelved entirely. Garth has since acknowledged that the project didn't land the way he hoped, though he's also defended it as an honest attempt to stretch, creatively rather than simply repeat a winning formula. It stands today as a reminder that even artists working at the peak of commercial success are willing to risk public confusion in the name of trying something different, and that not every risk pays off. Family life eventually found new footing. Garth had known Trisha Yearwood since the late 1980s, when both were rising country artists navigating Nashville together, long before either had reached the level of fame they would eventually achieve. Their friendship persisted through both of their first marriages. Once Garth's marriage to Sandy ended and Trisha's own marriage had also concluded, the friendship evolved into something more. Garth proposed to Trisha on stage during a concert in May 2005, and the two married in a private ceremony at their home in Oklahoma that December. Trisha has spoken about scaling back her own touring schedule significantly to help raise Garth's 3 daughters, describing a deliberate choice to prioritize ordinary domestic life, school events, dinners, day-to-day parenting, over the demands of a full-time touring career. That stability is widely credited as part of what eventually gave Garth the confidence to return to music. And when he did return, starting with a notable Las Vegas residency in the mid-2000s and then a full return to major touring beginning in 2014, the comeback was enormous. He didn't quietly reappear. He broke attendance and box office records across North America, proving that the audience that had made him a phenomenon in the 1990s hadn't gone anywhere, and that a new generation had grown up right alongside his legend. But 2014 also produced one of the more painful public setbacks of his career: the collapse of his planned Croke Park concerts in Dublin, Ireland. 5 sold-out shows were scheduled, representing roughly 400,000 tickets, an extraordinary demand for any artist anywhere in the world. Local residents near the stadium raised objections over noise and disruption, and Dublin City Council ultimately granted licenses for only 3 of the 5 planned shows rather than all 5. Garth made the decision to cancel all 5 concerts rather than choose which fans would get to attend and which would be left out, a decision rooted in a sense of fairness that nonetheless devastated hundreds of thousands of people who had already bought tickets and, in many cases, booked travel. Garth described the cancellation as one of the most painful moments of his career, comparing the emotional weight of it to a death in the family. It became a case study in how even an artist operating at the peak of global demand can be undone by forces entirely outside his control: local politics, permitting, and logistics that no amount of stardom could override. That kind of disappointment, though, is a professional wound. What Garth is dealing with now is something else entirely. In October 2024, a woman who had worked as a hairstylist and makeup artist for Garth and Trisha Yearwood, beginning with Trisha in 1999 and later working directly with Garth as well, filed a civil lawsuit in California accusing him of rape and sexual assault occurring on multiple occasions. The case was captioned Doe versus Roe, and in it Garth sought relief from what he described as ongoing attempted extortion, defamation, and false allegations of sexual misconduct, having filed his own lawsuit against her in Mississippi days before she went public, using pseudonyms for both parties. When she named him directly in her California filing, he amended his own complaint to name her as well, a decision her attorneys criticized publicly as retaliatory. Garth has denied every allegation and has consistently characterized the case as an attempted shakedown. Legal clarity. The legal fight itself has become almost as significant a story as the underlying allegations. Much of the litigation over the past year and a half has focused not on the assault claims directly, but on a secondary battle, whether Garth's accuser is entitled to proceed under a pseudonym, and which state's court system, California or Mississippi, will actually hear the substantive case. A federal judge in California declined to dismiss the lawsuit, but placed the California proceedings on hold pending developments in the Mississippi case, and as of mid-2026, neither lawsuit has reached trial, with all filings in the Mississippi case remaining sealed and no settlement announced. In May 2026, a federal appeals court declined Garth's request to speed up a ruling on the anonymity dispute, meaning the case remains, in essence, stuck in procedural limbo, unresolved on either its merits or its most basic jurisdictional questions. People close to Garth have described the ongoing uncertainty as an exhausting, almost unbearable strain, even as his wife Trisha Yearwood has remained publicly supportive of him throughout. Legal clarity, legal clarity. That unresolved cloud is what makes Garth Brooks' story at 64 feel so different from the version of his story that existed even 5 years ago. This isn't a man whose career simply slowed down with age, the way most legacy artists eventually experience. This is a man whose reputation, built for decades on an image of decency, sincerity, and old-fashioned trustworthiness, is now sitting in the middle of a legal fight that could take years more to resolve, with serious allegations on one side and firm denial on the other, and no public resolution in sight. It would be easy to reduce Garth Brooks to a single storyline: the rise or the scandal, or the family sacrifice, or the reinvention. But the truth of his story is that all of those threads exist simultaneously and always have. He is the man who built one of the largest music careers in American history from a small town in Oklahoma. He is the father who walked away from the peak of that career because he didn't want to miss his daughters growing up. He is the artist who took a strange creative risk with Chris Gaines and watched it fail publicly. He is the performer who canceled 5 sold-out Dublin shows rather than disappoint even one segment of his audience, and called it one of the worst moments of his life. And now, at 64, he's also a man facing a serious, unresolved legal accusation that has followed him for nearly 2 years without a clear ending. None of those chapters cancel each other out. That's the uncomfortable, complicated truth of it. A career built on scale and sincerity doesn't automatically explain away a legal battle, and a legal battle in progress doesn't erase 4 decades of documented professional achievement and, by many accounts, real personal sacrifice for his family. What's true is that Garth Brooks at 64 exists in the middle of all of it at once, still one of the best-selling artists who ever lived, still touring, still married to Trisha Yearwood, and still, as of this writing, waiting for a courtroom to eventually determine what actually happened. That's the real tragedy embedded in his story right now. Not a single event, not a single scandal, but the sheer unresolved weight of it, a man who spent his whole life trying to be defined by his music and his family, now forced to sit inside a legal process that could take years longer to finish, while the public forms its judgments long before any court does. Garth Brooks built an empire on being the guy audiences could trust completely. What happens to that legacy now depends entirely on what a courtroom ultimately decides, and until then, his story remains genuinely, uncomfortably unfinished.